Okay, everybody, let's go ahead and continue on learning about how to create websites with Dreamweaver. And the next thing we're going to go ahead and do is begin to learn about the basics of learning CSS. Now, there are a lot of different workflows that you can use in designing web pages. The workflow that I generally use is this. First thing that I do is I create my HTML structure and then I add my content to my page. And you can see that's where we're at right now. I have actually gone ahead and just copied some filler text here um, and placed it into my page just to fill things out. You can get some filler text from anywhere at all. The text I use is called lorem ipsum text, and it's a standard printer's placeholder text. So first thing I do is I create my HTML structure, then I add my content, and then I begin working on my CSS. The first thing I do in my CSS is I get everything positioned and spaced out the way I want things to look. I may not get the spacing exact at that point, but the first thing I do is I get everything positioned roughly the way I want it to. And then I go ahead and I start formatting things like my text and my images, changing things like fonts and styles and things like that. So first I do positioning, then I do the actual formatting. The process you go through can be whatever works the best for you. Some people do create a little bit of HTML, then they write a little bit of CSS, a little bit of HTML, a little bit of CSS, and that works best for them. Um, uh, so my workflow is not something that is written in stone. I'm going to go ahead and open up my style sheet here. And this is going to be where we create all of our CSS styling that's going to control the appearance of our web page. Now, a basic web page without any CSS applied to it is going to look something like this. Now, at first glance, you might think, okay, there's no formatting on this, but there actually is. There's spacing here, there's spacing here, there are these colors. The choice of the font is a styling decision. So there actually is a little bit of styling on this sheet. So the very first thing that we do is we remove all of the default formatting so that it doesn't mess us up as we continue on. So you want to remove all the default, what's called browser formatting from your document. And that's very easy to do. You do it with something called a CSS reset. A CSS reset. Now, there are different types of resets that accomplish different things. What we're going to use for our reset is something very simple. It's called a hard simple reset. A hard simple reset. And you do that by typing an asterisk, pressing the tab key, typing an opening bracket, and then margin, colon, 0, and then a semicolon, padding, colon, 0, and then a semicolon, and border, colon, 0, semicolon. And then we close our curly bracket. In HTML and CSS, different types of brackets mean different things. When we were working with HTML, we used the greater than and less than signs for brackets. You can also use square brackets for different things. Or here we just saw using curly brackets. It's very important to use the correct type of bracket. And here we're going to be using these curly brackets. So this is what's called a hard simple reset. Now, when I look at my HTML here, you're not going to see any changes. And that's because before anything you place in your CSS file can affect your HTML file, you need to link the two. You need some way to tell this HTML file here that it should be using this CSS file for its formatting. And you do that not in the body section as we've been working in, you do that in the head section. You do that in the head section because this is very obviously an instruction to the browser. Your website visitor doesn't need to know that this is the style sheet that controls the formatting. That's something your browser needs to know. So we're going to place that in the head section of the document. Now, the tag that you use to link a style sheet to an HTML page is called link. And here's where that confusion comes up because the A tag is for what we traditionally think of as links. The link tag links a style sheet to an HTML page. So I've gone in and typed link. Now, the link tag contains 4 attributes. Up to this point, we just used one attribute. The first attribute, just like our anchor tag, is href. And that goes ahead and it points to the file that you're going to go ahead and use for your style sheet. So you type in href equals and then a quotation mark. And here's one of the most useful features inside of Dreamweaver. It's a very simple feature, but it's extremely useful. Whenever you type an attribute out and then type the opening quote, it's always going to bring this browse option up for you. And when you press enter, it's going to bring up this select file dialog box, which looks a lot like an open dialog box. And you'll see here are all the different folders in our sample website. I'm going to go into the CSS folder, and there's my style sheet. I'll select that and click OK. And you'll see it placed the path to that style sheet. Down here, we were just referring to pages that were going to be in the same folder eventually as this page. So there's nothing other than the page name here. Here I actually have CSS/styles. And that basically says go look in the CSS folder and you'll find that styles.css. The second attribute that you need to go ahead and put in is the relationship attribute. And the value for that should be style sheet. We're linking to the CSS styles page. We need to know what kind of a link it is. It's a style sheet. The third attribute that you need to use is type. And the type tells what kind of style sheet you're working with. This is a text-based style sheet. And finally, you need one final attribute, the media attribute, which is going to be screen. We want to use this style sheet, or this text CSS style sheet, whenever you're viewing the web page on a screen, which means that if we print this web page, it shouldn't use these styles. And those are the two major kinds of style sheets that you're going to find. Print style sheets that control the way a web page would print out if somebody prints it, and then screenshot style sheets that show the way the web page would appear when displayed on the screen. And that's obviously the main style sheet. And then I close my bracket there. Now, all of the other style sheets items that all of the other tags that we've worked with would lead you to indicate that we should close that link tag, right? Watch what happens when I do a bracket and then a closing slash. It actually closes the head section, not the link section. And so that's a mistake, obviously. So we know that there's a problem here. And the problem is Actually, it isn't really a problem. The reason why that happened is that link is one of those very few HTML tags that does not require a closing tag at all. So we don't need to put that in there. So I've got my link tag and I have my 4 attributes: href, rel for relationship, type, and then finally media. And again, that's a long line. If you click this button right here, it will actually wrap. And again, that's just a preference as to how you like typing things in. I don't particularly like the wrapping, so I've turned that off. So now I'm going to save it. So now I've linked this style sheet with this HTML page, and let's see the way this looks now. Now you can see all that spacing is gone. Remember, before we did that style sheet, we had all that spacing in there. But after we put the link in, I'll paste that back in there again, now all that spacing is gone from there. The sizing is still going to be there. You'll see the font colors are still there. And Live View in Dreamweaver isn't really an exact representation of the way your web page is going to look in a browser. It really is an approximation. It's closer than what the plain design view would show you, but it's not an exact representation. But this is close enough for what we're working with right now. So now I'm going to go ahead and come back into my styles.css. And the first thing that I always am going to do in a style sheet is I'm going to go ahead and create styles for each one of the divs that I created on my page. So I'm going to go ahead and create a style that refers to that name div. And you do that very simply by typing the tic-tac-toe symbol, the hash mark, and then the name that you gave to that div, or the ID that you used. And this is actually called an ID style. There are 3 main kinds of styles that you can create: class styles, tag styles, and ID styles. For this class, we're going to mainly be dealing with ID styles and tag styles. And again, remember, I can tab over because spacing does not matter in my CSS. And then I'm going to type an opening bracket and a closing bracket. Anything you place inside of the opening bracket and the closing bracket, those are going to be the styles that are associated with that particular style rule. Here, for our reset, we actually had 3 different style commands. And these are actually called property value statements. Property value statements. The property is what is being affected. In this case, the margin is being affected, the padding, the border. This is the value, or the value that's being assigned to that particular property. If we did the, let's say, the font property, we could put in a font that we wanted to, or one or more than one font if we wanted to. If we did font size, well, we could make it 14 pixels. But you're always going to have a property and then a value assigned to that property. And again, those are property value statements. Now, how you write your CSS is entirely up to you. Some people like stringing their property value statements along like this in one line. Some people will do something like this. Some people might do a combination of that. Totally doesn't matter how you space these out. What does matter is that you get the property followed by a colon followed by the value, and then you end that property value statement with a semicolon. So they're always going to follow that same format. Property name, colon, property value, semicolon to end that property value statement. Now, in this case for name, I'm just going to leave that blank for right now because we're going to come back and do that a little bit later. And then I'm going to go ahead and do top nav. We didn't create it because it just had an image inside of it, but we do have a banner div that we're going to be placing, and that's where this element here goes. So we've got the name area, the top nav area, the banner area, content, right side, and footer. So now I'll go ahead and content, right side, footer. And again, you'll notice I sort of always use tabs and spacing to make everything sort of look neat on my page. There's nothing harder to do than figuring out where a problem is, where a bug is in your code when your code is written very sloppily. Always try and keep everything nice and clean. That's easier said than done, but you'll see that. Now, the next thing that we need to go ahead and do is we need to define the width for each one of these different elements. How wide is this element going to be? How wide is my top nav going to be? How wide should my banner be? My content area, my sidebar, my footer area down here. And there are actually a couple different ways to measure that in HTML or in CSS. You can use percentages. You can use, there are several proportional style measurements, but the unit of measurement we use the most is the measurement called pixel. A pixel. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say that the width of my name section should be 300 pixels. And I'm going to repeat that for each one of my elements here, with the exception of banner and footer. So I'm going to do width for my top nav is going to be, let's say, 550 pixels. Content, the width, I'm going to go ahead and make it 500 pixels. The right side will make the width 300 pixels. And the footer I'm going to leave blank here. The reason why I left the footer blank and the banner blank is because they stretch from side to side. So you don't actually need to put a width in for the banner and the footer. If you want to, just to be complete and to make everything match up, you could say width 100%. And I could do the same thing down here. I usually don't do that because it's just extra typing, but you can if you like. So we've gone ahead and we've set up the amount of spacing that everything is going to have here. Now, the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to tell the browser what should float to the left and what should float to the right. The name should float to the left. The top nav should float to the right. The content should float to the left. The sidebar should float to the right. Again, the banner and the footer, because they stretch all the way across, aren't going to float in either direction. So now we're going to go ahead and put some floats in. And that just basically means float it over to the left side or float it over to the right side. There's more to it than that, But right now, basically what you need to know is just that it will move that on over. It's very important to spell that right. So now let's go ahead and let's take a look and see the way our main.html is looking. And there we go. And that actually looks exactly the way we want it to look, or the way it should look right now. Because there's another very important element that you're going to put in, and that is going to be clearing. Clearing. Whenever you've floated something in HTML, like the left name or the name to the left, the top nav to the right, the element that comes after what you floated needs to have a clear statement on it. So we need to put a clear statement on the banner, and we also need to put a clear statement on the footer. So anything you don't float, you're going to clear. So I'm going to go ahead and underneath banner here, I'm going to go ahead and type clear, both. And I'm going to do the same thing for footer, clear, both. And that just basically means don't let any of the floating left or right affect those elements. And now let's go ahead and take a look at see what we've got here. And now we've got something that looks a lot more like what we want. We've got our name here. We've got our top navigation after that. Then we've got our content and our sidebar. The content's floated to the left. Sidebar's floated to the right. And the footer is down here at the bottom. And again, our page isn't coming completely together yet. We're not done yet, but we're well on our way to having everything spaced. Now, the one thing that I'm actually missing here that's going to be important for the layout is going to be my main banner image that we're going to use on the page. And before we go any further, I want to go ahead and put these images into the places that they need to be. And it's simply got this banner image right here along with these filler images down below. So let's go ahead now. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. Sorry about that. I actually have a folder here called Photos, and the only thing inside of here are these photos that we're going to use, these placeholder images that we're going to use. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and drag it into sample website 1, and then I'm going to drag that photos into images so that they're available for use. So I've now added that in there. And when I go back into Dreamweaver and we go into our images folder, you should see photos here. And I'm actually going to move the banner image just by dragging it up into banner. But the rest of these you can leave in whatever folder you choose to put them in. So now I'm going to go into code view here. And actually, let's take a look at our sample here. We can see that this big banner image comes right after top nav here. So I'm going to go ahead and right after top nav, I'm going to go ahead and create another div. I'm going to give it an ID of banner so that I can identify it later on. I'm going to close it. And then I'm going to go ahead and place the image inside of it. Now, the image tag is just simply img. So that's easy to remember. And it just requires one attribute, and that's the source attribute. And that actually is abbreviated. And again, just like before, I did that a little bit fast here. Just like before, once you've typed in an equal sign and a quote mark, it's going to bring up that browse option for you. And so I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And now I'm going to go ahead and go find that banner image. Now right now you can see I'm in my CSS folder, so I'm going to back up here, go into my images folder, and then go into banner, and there's my banner image right there. I will click OK, and you can see it's put the correct path in there. I'm going into the images folder, then into the banner folder, and finally I'm finding banner.jpg. So put the correct path in for me. Now, image is another one of those, I keep saying this, another one of the few tags that you don't need to close inside of HTML. So I'm just going to put a closing bracket there, and that will complete that. And now when we go ahead and take a look at it, there's that large banner image that's going to go right there. I also want to go ahead and put in some of these smaller images in here. These two images here, one in my sidebar, and then one down here in my content area. So I'm going to go ahead now and put those in as well. So I'm going to come in here to my content area, and let's go ahead and put those two images after the first paragraph there. And then again, that browse option. I'm going to come back into my photos folder, and there's image 1. And now we'll do image 2. And you got to remember to close that bracket. Even though you don't need a closing image tag, you do need to close the bracket. And then I'm going to go ahead down here, and that is actually image 4 right there. And then in my sidebar, I had just one image in there. Oops. And that was actually image 3. And now let's take a look at this, and you can see what we've got here. And actually I can see right off the back, looking at this, there isn't enough width in my content area to display both of these images side by side. So they're stacked on top of each other. So one of the very first things that I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to modify the width of my content here. And let's just make that 510. And let's see what that does. Now they're nice and side by side. Images will always go side by side given enough space, whereas things like paragraphs will stack on top of each other. So now we've got a fairly good start on this. Now, it's oftentimes, even with live view, hard to see the way your page is actually going to look by looking at it in Dreamweaver. So at this point, you're always going to want to come up to your preview option here and start previewing your web page in an actual browser, in Chrome or Firefox or Internet Explorer or Opera. And I usually preview everything in Chrome to start off with. Later on, you're going to want to make sure that you test your web pages in a variety of different browsers. At very minimum, Chrome, Firefox, and Internet Explorer. But you also could consider testing it in Opera. And there's another browser for Macintosh computers called Safari. But I'm going to go ahead and select previewing Chrome here, and that's going to bring this up here, and we can see the way my page is going to look. Now, when we look at our completed page, first thing that we're going to notice here is that the content for our page right now goes all the way from one side of the window to another. The content on our actual page is actually constrained into a particular area. So it's not going all the way from one side to another. And actually, I've zoomed out here a little bit to 75% just so you can see more of this. But you can see what's going on there. So the way we constrain our content into a particular area the way we're doing in our sample project is by going back into Dreamweaver and enclosing everything on your page in a div that you give the ID to of wrapper. So I'm going to go ahead and open that div right up there after the opening body tag, and then I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom and I'm going to close that. So now everything in my page, all of my other divs are contained inside of this wrapper div. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to come into my style sheet and I'm going to create a style for that wrapper div. And I'm going to make the width of this whole area 900 pixels wide. And now let's go ahead and take a look and see what that's done. And we preview this in Chrome. We can now see that everything has been compressed into that area. So our site is starting to look a little bit more the way we want it to look. But still, go ahead and delete that. Still, it's not centered on the page. And also, the actual content has a background color of white here, where the actual page background is this light gray that's out here. So we need to actually make those two changes next. So I'm going to come back in here to my CSS style sheet. And the way you center a div on a page is by using this command. Margin, colon, 0, auto, and then a semicolon. So up to this point, every property that we've created has always had one value associated with it. A float property and one value. In the case of this margin up here, we just had one value. For margin and padding, you can have anywhere between 1, 2, 3, and 4 different values. The most common of which are 1, 2, and 4. 3, you don't see 3 values very often. But if you have just one value for your margin, like in this case 0, that basically means put 0 pixels or 0 whatever all the way around that object. In this case, I left out the px for pixel, and your browser will assume that if you leave that off. But this means place 0 margin and 0 padding on the top, bottom, left, and right of that particular item. If you have two values, the first value represents the amount of space on the top and the bottom, and the second value gives it the space on the left and the right. If you have 4 values, for instance, if I was to do margin 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 15 pixels, and 10 pixels, it goes clockwise. 10 pixels on the top, 20 pixels on the right, 15 pixels on the bottom, 10 pixels on the left. So remember, it's clockwise. Top, right, bottom, and left. But for just 2 values, it's top and bottom and left and right. So that leaves, we know that we're going to have 0 pixels on the top and the bottom. What is auto? Auto basically means just balance it out. Put the same amount of space on the left as on the right. So now when we save this and look at our page inside of Chrome, and I'll go ahead and refresh my browser. Now you can see it's centered on the page with an equal amount of space. It automatically calculated an equal amount of space on both the left and the right. So we're getting closer to looking the way our actual sample project is. Now I want to set the background color for both the wrapper area as well as the page area or the body of the page. So I'm going to go back into Dreamweaver, and remember, you can use whatever line breaks or indentation you need to make things more readable. I hit enter and tab myself over, and I'm going to go ahead and use the property background color. And when I type a colon, again, this very helpful Dreamweaver menu appears. And I want to select color. So I'm going to go ahead and click on color there, or double click on color. It's going to bring up all these colors for you here. And I'm going to select white, and it put the code in that means white. 3 F's to the browser means white. And very quickly you're going to learn what these color codes mean, or at least the most common of these color codes mean. But you can always depend on Dreamweaver to do that for you. Now, to change something about the entire page, you're going to use the body tag. Now, unlike an ID, such as wrapper, name, top nav, you don't actually need to use that hash mark by body. This is called an ID tag. This is just, or I'm sorry, an ID style. This is just a tag style. And you can tell the difference by looking in your code. If you're referring to something by its ID, then you need the hash mark. If you're referring to a tag, then you're not going to need the hash mark. If I was to just do div, that would apply to every single div on my page. In this case, I want it to apply to the body, and I want to change the background color of the page to that light gray. So again, I'm going to select the color option there and select a very light gray here. All C's means very light gray. And now let's look at our page in Chrome. And again, I got to refresh this, and you're going to see the way that appears. One more thing we actually need to do for the wrapper. When we look at our completed item, we can see here there's some space actually on the top, bottom, left, and right. So we need to put a little bit of padding around this. And don't worry for right now the difference between margin and padding. But no, in this case, because we want the inside color to extend out, we're going to use padding. If we wanted the gray to fill in that area, we would use margin. We'll talk more about margin and padding a little bit later. But right now I'm going to go ahead and on the wrapper, I'm going to go ahead and type padding, 30 pixels, and save it. And now let's take a look at this inside of our browser. And we can see now it's even looking more like what we want. Now the next thing that I want to do is work on the spacing for this top navigation area up here. And the first thing that we're going to notice is that our finished items are located side by side as opposed to being stacked on top of each other. This is called being displayed in block format. When things are stacked on top of each other, we refer to that as being displayed in block format. When things are side by side, we refer to that as being displayed in inline format. So what we need to do is we need to tell our browser to display these list items in an inline format. So I'm going to come back over here to top nav. Now, I'm not talking about the entire top nav div. What I'm talking about displaying inline are these list items here, the individual items within top nav. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to the list item here. But how do I refer to the list items here differently from the list items down here? We'll see that in just a moment. Really quickly, if I was to come in here and for some reason or other just type LI bracket display inline, I will get something like what I want for my top nav elements here. So let's again go back into Chrome and let's take a look at that, and you can see those are now being displayed in line. They're not aligned to the right, but they are side by side now. But you're also going to notice the names down here are also being displayed in line. They're side by side. So when it comes to my list items, there's a difference between the way I want list items in my content area displayed and the way I want list items inside of my top nav area to be displayed. So I need to go ahead and make a change on that. So what we do with this is we actually refer to the exact location of the list items that we're going to be working on in this, or that we want to affect. So when we come back in here to main.html, I can see the list items that I want to affect are inside of the top nav div in an unordered list, and then I find the list items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to top nav, and notice I put the hash mark next to it because that is an ID, and then UL and then LI. And we'll save that. And now when we go ahead and go into Chrome here and refresh our page, we can see these are now being displayed side by side, whereas these are stacked on top of each other, and these are as well. So I'm only affecting, and we're going to see how to format the dots here a little bit later, but we can see how by specifying in our CSS the exact path to what we're trying to modify, we can achieve different effects for the same type of item. And I'm going to go ahead and cut that and just paste this down here under top nav. And again, I like keeping everything nice and orderly, so I'm going to go ahead and space these out again just like that. And again, whatever spacing you use in your code, as long as it's readable, you're doing fine. So we've now said display the top nav list items in an inline fashion. But I also don't want them to be exactly side by side the way they are here. I want them to actually be spaced out a little bit. So I want to put a little bit of spacing on the left-hand side of each one of these elements. So I'm going to go ahead and again go into my definition for that. And in this case, I want to set some margin, but I only want that margin on the left. So I'm going to do margin dash left colon 15px and save it. And now when we take a look at this, we should see, and again I got to refresh that, we should see a little bit more spacing. I also want to align that over here to the right, so I'm going to do that as well. And you do that by simply changing the container for those list items, which is the UL. And I'm going to use text align right here. And we'll go ahead and save that. And now when we go back into our browser and refresh it, you'll see those items are aligned over to the right-hand side of that. So more and more we're starting to look like what our project is looking like. Now there's also some space here in between the banner and the name. So let's go ahead and do that next. So here I've got my banner, and I'm going to go ahead and do margin. Now remember how I said if you put two values in, the first value for margin is the top and the bottom, and the second value for margin is the left and the right. So I'm going to put in 30, 0 there, and I'm going to come back in here, and let's take a look and let's see how that looks. And you can see it put it on the bottom, but not on the top. And this is a quirky item with CSS. I'm also going to go ahead and put that same margin bottom on my company name, on my name div right here. And that should push that down as well. So I'm going to go back into Dreamweaver. And I'm going to go ahead and on the name div, type margin dash bottom 30px. And we'll save that. Come back in here. And now you can see I've got a little bit of spacing. Now a question that often comes up at this point is, what's the difference between margin dash bottom 30px and margin 00 30px 0? Or I could put px in there. Whenever you're doing a 0, the px is optional, but you can see that. So what's the difference between this and this? The answer is this actually declares the top, right, and left margins to be 0, whereas this doesn't say anything at all about the top, right, or left margins. All it does is say something about the margin on the bottom. And in a lot of cases, such as this one, it really doesn't matter which style you use. There are occasions where it will become important, but in this case, it's not important. So let's go ahead and take a look at this, and we can see where we're at now. I may want to push my top navigation elements down just a little bit. We can do that by putting some margin on the top of our top nav. So let me go back into Dreamweaver here. And there's top nav. And I'm going to go ahead and do margin dash top. And I'm going to do 15 pixels. Save it. Let's take a look at it in our browser. Refresh, and we can see I can bump that down a little bit there. Since the overall width here is 900 pixels, and this is 510 pixels, and this is 300 pixels, I'm naturally getting this spacing right in here. And we're not going to worry about the spacing right now amongst our text elements. The last thing I want to go ahead and do is I actually want to go ahead and put some spacing on my footer, so it's not right up against my header, or not right up against my content area. So we're going to come down here into footer, and I'm going to type margin top 30 pixels and save it. And now we'll come into our browser, and you can see how, whoops, that's not going down. Why isn't that going down? Let me go ahead and try margin on that. So here we go. And the rule here is if margin doesn't work, try padding. And later we're going to go in and tweak that a little bit. But for right now, padding will work for us. And let's come back in here. And now you can see I've got a little bit of space in between my content area and my footer. So now we've got everything more or less spaced out here. And the next thing that we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to use our CSS to actually set up a little bit more formatting. We're going to change our font, apply some spacing in the content and the right sidebar area, bump these list items over so they don't look unusual. And then we're going to go ahead and take a look at building our pages with templates. Now, in the case of our page, I want to change the overall font that I'm going to go ahead and use. So I'm going to go ahead and go back into Dreamweaver here. And this is something that I can do on the body tag. So I'm going to come into my body tag. And I'm going to go ahead and use the font family property. And the font that I want to actually use is Arial. And now we'll go ahead and take a look at this in a browser, and you can see the font for everything on my page has now changed into that Arial. You can also see that my slogan here is a little bit too big for the width that we actually gave it in the name area. So I could either make the font a little bit smaller or give myself a little bit more space by changing that to, let's say, 330, and then you'll see there's enough space in there for that. We can also give our headings a certain amount of space. Now, for this, you can choose whether or not you want to do them all, which would affect, again, our top our name element here, or whether you want to specify something to be different between our different areas here, which we're going to do. We're going to specify a different font size for the content area as for the sidebar area. So I'm going to come back in here to my CSS, and here's my content div style, and I'm just hitting enter here to give myself a little bit more room. I keep highlighting things, and then I'm going to go ahead and do content H1. So I only want to affect the H1s, and I'm going to select font size is going to be, let's say, 32 pixels, and I want to go ahead and say margin for this is going to be 0, 0, 15 pixels, 0. And again, I could have put margin bottom, margin dash bottom, colon 15 pixels. In this case, it does exactly the same thing. So let's go ahead and take a look at this and see how that's going to look. And you can see we bumped down a little bit of space there. And now let's go ahead and do the second level as well as our paragraphs, our second level headings and our paragraphs. So I'm going to go ahead now and content H2, font size is going to be, let's say, 24 pixels, and margin, in this case I want some margin on the top and the bottom, so I'm going to do 15 pixels, 0. And remember, this means top and bottom, left and right. And now let's go ahead and take a look at that, and you can see we've now spaced that out. Now we're also going to notice that everything is sort of here broke at this point. What the heck is going on with that? I can see I did get my spacing in, but obviously there's a problem somewhere. So I'm going to come back in here and look in Dreamweaver, and as you look at this code here, it may be hard to find the problem. But one way that Dreamweaver really does help you find problems is by the color coding. You're going to see certain things are in blue, certain things are in pink. The item to remember that's important here is that your style names are in pink. What we can see right side here is not in pink, it's in blue. So I can definitely see that there's a problem here. And the problem is that I didn't close my bracket. When I close my bracket, when I put that closing curly brace in, now you can see that this is now pink. Everything's looking more the way it should. And now when we go ahead and take a look at this and refresh it, we can see that everything has sort of gone back to the way it was, with the exception of the margin that we placed on here. So sometimes the mistakes or the omissions that we have in our CSS are really hard to find, because you need to get every little punctuation mark correct. Every bracket needs to be correct. Every semicolon needs to be in the proper place. A lot of times those problems are really hard to find, but they are there. And as time goes on, as you work more with HTML and CSS, you're going to find that they're easier to find. The first thing that when something's misbehaving for me, the first thing that I always look at is my punctuation, whether it's in my HTML or my CSS. I look at my brackets, my colons, my semicolons, and usually that's where the problem is. And we'll do content. We're going to format our paragraphs here, and I can do font size is going to be 14 pixels. If I want to change the line height, there's a property for line height. And again, all these items are listed in that handout. I'm going to make the line height 150%, and then margin 10 pixels 0, and remember my curly brace. And now when I take a look at this in my browser window, you can see the font size has changed. I've got a little bit more spacing in there as well. I also want to bump these list items over, and I want to put some padding on the top and the bottom of the list items. So now I'm going to go ahead and first let's take care of the top and the bottom spacing. I'm going to do content UL because that's the container for the list items. If I did content LI, it would put spacing on the top and the bottom of every individual line item. In this case, I want it on the top and the bottom of the container. And so I'm going to do margin 10 pixels 0. And then the individual list items I want bumped over so that the bullet isn't hanging out. I'm going to do margin left 30 pixels. And the same thing as far as you may be wondering where I'm coming up with these numbers. I'm just pulling them out of my head right now. As you work more with CSS, you're going to get a sixth sense of what a pixel is for a design. And it will be easier to work with. And now you can see I've bumped those over, and there's also a little bit of spacing in there as well. Now, I want to do basically the same thing on the right side over here. So the quickest way to do that is actually going to be just to highlight, and I actually don't have any H1s, so I'm just going to highlight these here, copy them, and paste them right in there underneath right side. I'm then going to highlight the word right side, copy it, and paste that over there. Clean up my spacing. And so now I have the same styles for right side. So let's take a look at this and let's see how that looks. Sure enough, we've got what we want there. So you can see how easy it is to space out your different elements here. Now the last thing I want to go ahead and do is I want to format my top navigation elements here. And you can see right now they're just these small blue links that have an underline underneath them. My actual links, when you hover over, are black, but when you hover over them, they become gray. So let's go ahead and make those changes. Now again, this has to do with the top nav here, and it has to do with our links. So I'm going to go ahead and do top nav A. I want to affect the A's. I could have typed in top nav ULLIA and gotten to the same thing, but in this case I just want to do top nav A. And first thing that I want to go ahead and do is I want to change the font size to 18 pixels, and I want to make them bold. So I'm going to go ahead and do font size 18 pixels, font weight bold, close my curly brackets, and then I'm going to go ahead and take a look at this, and let's see what we've got. There we go. Now I'm going to take the underline off of them, and that's done with the command text decoration, or the property text dash decoration, and the value you want there is none. Text decoration none. And there we can see we've removed the underline. Now, as far as the color of our links goes, we actually have two different colors that we need to specify. One, the regular link color, and the other, the color that we hover over. And there are actually 5 different link states. There's the normal link state, the visited link state, the hover state, the focus state, and the active state. The only 2 that we're going to worry about for this class are going to be the normal link state and the hover state. So I'm going to come in here, and how do I specify that? Well, I know I'm only working on the top nav item, so I'm going to do top nav. And I know I'm specifying, I'm working with my A tags. I'm going to type then a colon and the word link. And that's how you specify the normal state of a link. And then I'm going to do an opening bracket, the property color, and then again I'm going to click on that color option there, and I can select the color that I want that to be. All zeros means black. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing, top nav, a hover, and then color. And you don't actually need to use this color option in here to click on it. If you know the numbers that you want to use, like I know I want to use all 4s because I want it to be kind of a dark gray but not too light, I can just type that in there. And now when I refresh this page here, instead of them being blue, they're black, except when I hover over them, they change to a slightly lighter gray color. That's not a very big change, so maybe I make this all 7s. And then refresh. And you can see the effect that's there. So now we basically have all the spacing and our layout done for our page. It certainly doesn't look like a completed web page like this, but this is where you want to be at this point. If you're worried about getting everything spaced out and laid out correctly at the same time as you're worried about the colors and the exact images that you're using and the fonts that you're using, you're going to get overwhelmed. So again, my workflow is basically set up the HTML, add my content, then write my basic CSS that gets everything more or less looking the way I want it to look. I don't even use real images at this point. I use these placeholder images that I create. And it's just a simple matter of opening Fireworks or Photoshop and creating an image with a gray background, and in this case a little bit of text. I normally just use a gray background because I don't need any text in there. They're just placeholders. And the same thing goes for the text that you use here. All of this is just placeholders, so that you're only focused on, okay, how is my layout going to look basically? How is everything going to be spaced out? After that, after you've done that, you can then worry about creating the individual pages, making sure everything is linking right, and then adding your actual content to your page, adding your images, your fonts, you know, all that good sort of all that good sort of stuff. And actually, the easiest part of creating a web page is going from this to this. When we actually get to that point, you're going to be really surprised at how easy it is to go from this to this and how quickly we're capable of doing that. Basically, all you have to do is add in your images, type in your text, change a few colors, set your fonts, and you're done. So this is actually the hardest part of our project, is getting this all laid out. And again, you can go back and watch the recording of this training series as many times as you want to get these different elements, or to understand these different elements. And again, I have these two handouts here on HTML and CSS that I really hope you take some time to read through, because they really will be helpful for you. We're going to go ahead now and take a short break, again 10 minutes, and when we come back, we're going to go ahead and create a template from this sample page, create our actual pages from that template, and then go ahead and transform the template into our actual site by adding our appropriate text and images that we have here. So we are actually probably 80-85% done, and definitely all the hard work is done at this point. So when we come back, we'll create our templates, set up our pages, and add our content. I will see you in 10 minutes.